Sometimes, the most devastating moments in life lead us to the most extraordinary discoveries. When Officer Ryan Carter arrived at a remote coastal village after a massive tsunami, he expected to find only heartbreak and loss. Instead, while searching for survivors in the flooded ruins, Ryan stumbled upon something impossible: a hidden tunnel behind a waterfall. Inside this ancient chamber, he found artifacts and strange markings that pointed to one mysterious date, 1142. This wasn't just old ruins. It was evidence of a lost civilization with advanced knowledge that vanished without explanation nearly 900 years ago. Now Ryan must race to uncover their secrets before dangerous forces destroy everything he's discovered. But what really happened to make an entire advanced society disappear? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Officer Ryan Carter had seen enough tragedy in 20 years of police work to recognize the particular silence that follows devastation. It wasn't the absence of sound. There were still distant voices calling names, the scrape of debris being moved, the steady drip of water from damaged roofs. It was the absence of hope that created this heavy quiet. The way a community holds its breath when it doesn't yet know how many of its own have been lost. The tsunami had struck Bahia Perdida 3 days ago, a wall of water 30 feet high. That had swept inland for nearly 2 miles before retreating, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the aftermath of a war. Ryan stood at the edge of what had once been the village square, his weathered hands resting on his utility belt, taking in the scope of the destruction with the practiced eye of someone who had worked disaster scenes before. But nothing quite prepared you for this scale of loss. At 52, Ryan carried himself with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned to conserve his energy for when it mattered most. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed despite 3 days in the field, and his dark eyes held the kind of steady focus that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. He had requested this assignment personally when the call came in for experienced officers to assist with search and rescue operations. His supervisor had tried to talk him out of it. Ryan was due for vacation time, had been working without a break for months since his wife Margaret's funeral. But that was precisely why he needed to be here. Work had always been his way of processing grief, of finding meaning when the world stopped making sense. Margaret would have understood. She had been a nurse for 30 years, had seen her own share of human suffering, and she had never judged him for the way he threw himself into cases when the weight of loss became too much to bear. The empty house in Sacramento felt like a tomb these days, filled with memories that hurt more than they comforted. At least here, his pain could serve a purpose. "Officer Carter?" The voice belonged to Maria Santos, a local park ranger who had been serving as his guide through the more remote areas surrounding the village. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of practical beauty that came from a life spent outdoors sun-weathered. Skin, strong hands, eyes that missed nothing. Her family had lived in this region for 5 generations, and she knew every trail, every hidden valley, every seasonal stream that might conceal survivors, or, more likely, bodies that needed to be recovered with dignity. "What have you found?" Ryan asked, turning from his contemplation of a house that had been reduced to its foundation and a few standing walls. "There are voices coming from the jungle area near Cascada de los Susurros Whispering Falls. It's about 2 miles uphill from here, but the path is treacherous after the flooding. I think we might have survivors who were caught up there when the water hit." Ryan nodded, already reaching for his pack. He had learned long ago that in disaster zones, you followed every lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Hope was a fragile thing, but it was also surprisingly resilient. How long to get there? Under normal circumstances, maybe 40 minutes. With all the debris and mudslides, probably double that. Maria shouldered her own pack, which Ryan had noticed was always perfectly organized medical supplies, rope, emergency rations, and a dozen other items that spoke to someone who took preparedness seriously. I should warn you, the area around the falls has always been considered sacred by the older villagers. There are stories about it going back centuries. What kind of stories? Ryan asked as they began picking their way through the rubble-strewn streets toward the jungle trail. Maria paused at the edge of the village, where the damage gave way to the lush green of the rainforest. Even 3 days after the tsunami, the jungle looked almost untouched. Nature had a way of absorbing trauma and continuing on. The kind that make you wonder how much history we've forgotten, she said quietly. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old ones, the people who lived here before the Spanish came. She said they built things that couldn't be built, knew things they shouldn't have known. They walked in comfortable silence for the first part of the journey, both focused on navigating the treacherous path. The trail had been carved out by centuries of foot traffic, but the recent flooding had washed away crucial sections and left others clogged with fallen trees and debris. Ryan found himself grateful for Maria's steady presence. She moved through the jungle with the confidence of someone who belonged here, pointing out unstable sections of trail and safe places to step. The sounds of the village gradually faded. Behind them, replaced by the constant symphony of the rainforest birds calling, insects humming, the distant sound of water running over stone. It was a world away from the urban chaos Ryan was used to, and he found something deeply calming about the rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other, following an ancient path toward an uncertain destination. Tell me about Professor Chun, Ryan said as they paused to rest at a relatively flat section of trail. Maria had mentioned the elderly academic several times, always with a mix of affection and respect that suggested he was more than just another outsider studying the region. Dr. Chun arrived here about 15 years ago to study the pre-Columbian cultures of the Pacific coast. Maria explained, using a fallen log as a seat while she adjusted the straps on her pack. He was supposed to stay for a semester, maybe write a few papers. Instead, he fell in love with the place and never left. He's become something of an institution. The villagers trust him, which is saying something for an outsider. Most importantly, he's one of the few people who takes the old stories seriously. What do you mean by that? Maria was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. Academic historians have a tendency to dismiss oral traditions as folklore, myth, superstition. But Dr. Chun has spent years documenting the stories passed down through generations, comparing them to archaeological evidence, looking for patterns. He's found things that don't quite fit the official narrative of what happened in this region. They resumed walking, the path becoming steeper as they approached the falls. Ryan could hear the sound of rushing water growing louder, though they couldn't see it yet through the dense canopy. The air was getting cooler and more humid, heavy with mist that clung to everything like a blessing. What kind of things? Ryan pressed. Artifacts that are too sophisticated for their supposed time period. Construction techniques that required engineering knowledge that supposedly didn't exist in pre-Columbian America. Stories about people who could predict earthquakes and floods, who built structures that survived disasters that destroyed everything around them. Maria glanced back at him as they navigated around a massive tree that had fallen across the trail. The kind of things that make you wonder if maybe our ancestors weren't as primitive as we like to think. The sound of the falls was much louder now, a constant roar that made conversation difficult. They were climbing more steeply, using roots and rocks as handholds in places where the trail had been completely washed away. Ryan's legs burned with the effort, but he also felt more alive than he had in months. There was something about physical challenge, about working toward a clear goal, that helped quiet the constant ache of loss that had been his companion since Margaret's death. When they finally reached the clearing where Cascada de los Susurros tumbled down a sheer rock face into a pool, that had been carved smooth by centuries of falling water. Ryan understood why the local people considered it sacred. The falls were perhaps 60 feet high, creating a curtain of white water that caught the late afternoon sunlight and threw it back in brilliant rainbows. The pool at the base was a deep green-blue that spoke of significant depth, surrounded by moss-covered rocks and tropical plants that seemed to glow with their own inner light. But what captured Ryan's attention wasn't the natural beauty, it was the sound of voices, faint but unmistakably human, seeming to come from somewhere behind the waterfall itself. "Did you hear that?" Maria asked, confirming that he hadn't imagined it. They called out, identifying themselves as rescue workers, and received weak but audible responses in Spanish. Maria translated 3 villagers, a family that had been caught in the flooding, while gathering medicinal plants, had taken shelter in what they described as a cave behind the falls. They were injured but alive, had been surviving on water from the falls and what little food they had been carrying. "How do we get back there?" Ryan asked, studying the curtain of water that concealed whatever space lay behind it. "There's supposed to be a path that runs along the edge of the pool," Maria said, but she was frowning as she looked at the water level. "The flooding has changed everything. It might be underwater now." They spent the next hour figuring out how to safely navigate around the edge of the pool to reach the space behind the waterfall. It required rope work and careful timing with the waves created by the falling water. But eventually, they managed to work their way behind the curtain into what Ryan had expected to be a simple cave. Instead, they found themselves standing at the entrance to something that defied explanation. The space behind the waterfall opened into a natural chamber, perhaps 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with walls that showed clear evidence of human modification. But it was what lay beyond the natural cave that stopped them both in there. Tracks, a tunnel entrance, clearly artificial, that disappeared into darkness with the kind of precision stonework that spoke of master craftsmanship. The 3 survivors huddled near the cave entrance: an elderly man, a woman who might have been his daughter, and a boy of perhaps 12 were as surprised to see Ryan and Maria as the rescuers were to see the tunnel. "How long has this been here?" Ryan asked in his basic Spanish, gesturing toward the tunnel entrance. The old man's eyes were bright with fever, but his voice was steady as he replied. Maria translated. "He says his grandfather brought him here once when he was a child. Told him it was a place where the old ones used to live. He says the tunnel goes deep into the mountain, but his family was always forbidden from going inside." As Ryan helped Maria provide first aid to the injured family and prepare them for the difficult journey back to the village, he couldn't stop staring at that tunnel entrance. The stonework was unlike anything he had seen in his travels through Central America. Each block fitted so precisely that you couldn't slip a knife blade between them, with no mortar visible anywhere. The sophistication of the construction suggested builders with knowledge and tools that shouldn't have existed in this region centuries ago. More intriguingly, there were symbols carved into the stone around the entrance, symbols that looked purposeful rather than decorative. And among those symbols, carved deep into the rock in a way that had protected them from centuries of weather, was something that made Ryan's breath catch in his throat. Numbers. Clear. Recognizable numbers that spelled out a date, 1142. As they carefully helped the survivors navigate back around the dangerous pool and begin the long journey down to the village, Ryan found his mind racing with questions. What kind of civilization had existed here in 1142? What had they been capable of? And perhaps most importantly, what had happened to them? The old man, whose name was Carlos, seemed to sense Ryan's fascination with the tunnel. As they paused to rest during the descent, he spoke quietly to Maria, who listened intently before turning to Ryan. "He says his grandmother used to tell stories about the people who built that place," she translated. "She said they weren't just advanced, they were wise. They could read the signs in the earth and sky, could predict when disaster was coming. But something happened to them. Something terrible, and they vanished almost overnight. What kind of disaster? Ryan asked. Carlos spoke again, his voice growing weaker as exhaustion set in, but his words were clear and deliberate. Maria's face grew thoughtful as she listened. He says it was something that comes in cycles, something that returns every few centuries. His grandmother called it La Ira de la Tierra, the anger of the earth. She said the old ones built there tunnels and chambers not just as homes, but as warnings for those who would come after. As they finally reached the village as the sun was setting, Ryan helped load Carlos and his family into the medical transport that would take them to the regional hospital. But even as he went through the motions of filing his report and coordinating with other rescue teams, his mind kept returning to that tunnel, to those impossible symbols, to the date that shouldn't exist. That night, as he lay in his sleeping bag in the temporary shelter that had been set up for rescue workers, Ryan stared up at the stars visible through a gap in the tent and wondered if he had stumbled onto something that would change everything he thought he knew about history. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to report the tunnel discovery to his superiors or whether to investigate it quietly first. Either way, he knew his life had just become significantly more complicated. Ryan had never been one to let curiosity override good judgment, but the tunnel behind Whispering Falls haunted his thoughts through a restless night. By dawn, he had made his decision. The official search and rescue operations were winding down. Most of the missing had been accounted for, and the focus was shifting to recovery and cleanup. He could spare a day to investigate what might be the archaeological discovery of the century. Maria was waiting for him at the village medical station when he mentioned wanting to return to the falls. Her eyes lit up with the same mixture of curiosity and caution he had been feeling. "I was hoping you'd say that," she admitted. "I barely slept thinking about those symbols. And Dr. Chun is beside himself with excitement. I told him about the tunnel last night." Professor Chun turned out to be a compact man in his 70s with intense energy that made him seem decades younger. His silver hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and his clothes had the practical quality of someone who spent most of his time in the field. "Officer Carter, I cannot tell you how significant this discovery could be," Chun said in lightly accented English. "Based on Maria's description of the stonework and the date carving, we may be looking at evidence of a previously unknown advanced civilization." "Unknown how?" Ryan asked as they gathered supplies for exploration: powerful flashlights, rope, measuring tools, and a camera. "The historical record for this region in the 12th century is fragmentary at best," Chun explained as they began the trek to the falls. Nothing in the archaeological record suggests the kind of sophisticated engineering Maria described. If this tunnel system dates to 1142, it could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian technology. The journey felt different this time. Without injured survivors to worry about, they could move more quickly and pay closer attention to their surroundings. Ryan found himself noticing carved stones incorporated into what he had assumed were natural formations, terraced areas that might once have been cultivated. "How much of this is natural and how much is constructed?" he asked as they paused at an overlook. "That's exactly the right question," Chun replied. "One of the hallmarks of truly advanced ancient engineering is the ability to work with natural formations rather than against them." Getting behind the waterfall was easier this time, with rope already in place. But stepping into the tunnel itself felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The passage was approximately 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, with walls that were polished stone reflecting their lights. The floor was paved with rectangular stones that fit together seamlessly. Most remarkably, the tunnel was completely dry despite being directly behind a waterfall. "This is impossible," Maria whispered as they moved deeper. "The level of craftsmanship here rivals anything the Romans achieved, but it predates European contact by centuries." Ryan examined the walls more closely. These aren't just stones. Feel this, it's like they were cut with precision tools, then polished. What kind of technology would that require? Technology that wasn't supposed to exist. In the Americas in 1142, Chun replied grimly. The walls weren't entirely smooth. There were symbols carved into the stone at regular intervals, not random decorative elements, but what appeared to be a deliberate sequence of information. Some were recognizable as numbers, others looked like astronomical symbols. The tunnel curved gently downward, descending deeper into the mountain. After perhaps 200 yards, it opened into a chamber that left all three of them speechless. The room was circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling. Stone pedestals arranged in a precise pattern held objects that clearly didn't belong in a 12th century archaeological site. On the nearest pedestal sat what appeared to be a navigational instrument, a complex arrangement of metal rings and indicators. Despite its obvious age, the metal showed no signs of corrosion, and when Ryan gently touched one of the rings, it moved with smooth precision. This should not exist, Chun said quietly. This level of metallurgy, this understanding of precision. Mechanics, it's impossible for this time period. Maria was examining another pedestal that held what looked like a book made of an unidentifiable material. The pages were thin and flexible, but with a translucent quality that seemed to glow faintly in their flashlight beams. It's an illuminated manuscript, she breathed. But look at these star charts. These are showing astronomical positions with a level of accuracy that requires telescopic observation. Ryan moved to stand beside her, studying the intricate diagrams. Are you saying these people had telescopes in 1142? I'm saying these diagrams show knowledge that shouldn't have been possible without telescopes, Maria replied. Chun had found a third pedestal that held what appeared to be an optical instrument. Complex arrangement of lenses and mirrors that had been precision ground and assembled with extraordinary skill. When he carefully adjusted one of the components, the entire device seemed to come alive, focusing and redirecting their flashlight beams in startling ways. Crystal lens array, he murmured. This demonstrates an understanding of light refraction and optical science that European civilization wouldn't achieve for another 500 years. As they moved around the chamber, documenting each artifact, Ryan found himself grappling with implications that seemed to grow more staggering by the minute. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was evidence of technological sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development. But perhaps most disturbing were the carved panels that covered the walls between the pedestals. Unlike the artifacts, which represented knowledge and achievement, these carvings told a story of disaster and loss. Scene after scene depicted natural catastrophes, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and human response to them. It's a historical record, Chun said as they studied the panels. But not just any history. This appears to be a record of cyclical disasters. Look at the dating. Symbols. They're showing a pattern of catastrophic events occurring at regular intervals. Maria was translating what she could of the symbolic writing. This section seems to be talking about the time of warning, and this one about the great preparation. And here it talks about those who remain to guide the next awakening. Remain where? Ryan asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Here, Chun said softly. This chamber, these tunnels, I don't think this was just a repository of knowledge. I think it was designed as a shelter, a place where knowledge and people could survive whatever catastrophic cycle they were recording. Ryan was studying a section of wall carvings that seemed different from the others, more recent somehow, though still clearly ancient. The symbols included numerical notations that made his blood run cold. Maria, can you read this section? He asked. She studied the symbols carefully, her frown deepening. It's talking about a cycle completion. Something about the return of the Earth's anger. And the numbers, I think these are dates. Future dates. What kind of future dates? Predictions of when the next catastrophic cycle will occur. Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. Based on these calculations, if I'm reading this correctly, the next major event is supposed to happen soon. According to this, very soon. The three of them stood in silence, absorbing the implications. This wasn't just an archaeological site, it was a warning system, a message from the past about recurring natural disasters. Ryan's practical mind was already racing ahead to immediate problems. If word of this got out, the site would be overrun long before they could properly study and protect it. But if Maria's translation was correct, they might not have the luxury of a careful, methodical study. We need to be very careful about who we tell about this, he said finally. At least until we understand more about what we're dealing with. Chine nodded gravely. This discovery is too important to risk having it compromised by premature exposure. Maria was still studying the wall. Carvings, her expression troubled. There's something else. These symbols aren't just predicting natural disasters. They're describing how to recognize the warning signs, how to prepare, how to survive. This entire chamber is designed as an instruction manual. As they carefully made their way back through the tunnel, each carrying the weight of what they had discovered, Ryan found himself thinking about the responsibilities that came with knowledge. Back in the sunlight outside the falls, as they sat catching their breath, Maria voiced what they were all thinking. We can't just pretend we didn't see this. If there's even a chance those predictions are accurate, people need to know. But we also can't let this turn into a media circus, Chun replied. The scientific value could be destroyed overnight if it's not handled properly. Ryan was quiet for a long moment, watching the water cascade down the rock face that concealed such extraordinary secrets. We need help, he said finally. We need people we can trust, people with the expertise to understand what we found and the authority to protect it while we figure out what it means. The problem was, Ryan wasn't sure such people existed. But looking at Maria and Chun, seeing the same mixture of wonder and responsibility in their eyes that he was feeling, Ryan realized that sometimes you had to trust that the right people would recognize the importance of doing the right thing. The question was whether they would have time to find those people before whatever cycle the ancient civilization had been tracking reached its completion. The next morning brought complications Ryan hadn't anticipated. While examining digital photos of the chamber artifacts on Maria's camera, his radio crackled with an urgent message from his supervisor. Carter, we need you to wrap up operations there within 48 hours. Lieutenant Morrison's voice was strained. Federal Emergency Management is taking over coordination, and they want all non-essential personnel cleared out. Ryan stared at the radio before responding. Copy that, Lieutenant. Any word on extending my assignment? There are ongoing investigations. That could benefit from local continuity. Negative. Budget constraints and personnel needs back home. Time to come back to regular duty. The irony wasn't lost on Ryan. Just when he had stumbled onto what might be the most significant discovery of his lifetime, bureaucracy was calling him home. He looked across their makeshift command center in the village school, where Maria was sketching symbols from their photographs. Problems? She asked, looking up from her notebook. The kind that come with being a civil servant, Ryan replied. I'm being recalled in 2 days. Federal Emergency Management is taking over, which means this becomes their jurisdiction. Maria's face darkened. FEMA isn't known for archaeological sensitivity. If they decide the tunnel represents any structural threat, they could seal it off permanently. Professor Chun looked up from comparing chamber symbols to his reference books. Or worse if word gets out about potential historical significance. We could have treasure hunters swarming the site before any proper scientific study. Ryan found himself caught between competing loyalties. His duty as a police officer was clear: follow orders, return to regular assignment. file appropriate reports. But his growing understanding of their discovery suggested that standard procedures might result in loss of invaluable historical knowledge. "What if we documented everything we could in the next 48 hours?" he suggested. "Built a comprehensive record that could protect the site regardless of jurisdiction changes." "It's not enough time," Chan said, shaking his head. "That chamber we explored yesterday, I'm convinced it's part of a much larger complex. The tunnel system probably extends deep into the mountain, possibly connecting multiple chambers with different functions." Maria studied her sketches of wall carvings, expression thoughtful. "There's something else. These predictions about cyclical disasters, if they're accurate, timing could be crucial. We might not have the luxury of lengthy archaeological study." Before Ryan could respond, they were interrupted by a government sedan that looked out of place in the rural village. Two men in dark suits emerged, their bearing immediately marking them as federal agents. "Officer Carter?" The older man approached, credentials already in hand. "Agent Davidson, Department of Homeland Security. This is Agent Rodriguez. We understand you've been conducting unauthorized archaeological activities." Ryan felt his jaw tighten. Someone had reported their activities, which meant their window for a quiet investigation had closed. "I've been conducting search and rescue operations as assigned. Any archaeological observations were incidental to those duties. Nevertheless, we need you to brief us on anything that could represent a security concern or interfere with federal emergency response operations." The phrasing was careful, but Ryan could read between the lines. Someone had flagged the tunnel discovery as a potential complication. The agents weren't here to protect archaeological treasures. They were here to assess and potentially eliminate anything that might slow bureaucratic processes. "What kind of security concerns?" Maria asked, voice carefully neutral. Agent Rodriguez consulted a tablet. "Structural integrity issues, potential environmental hazards, anything that might complicate infrastructure rebuilding. We understand there's been speculation about historical significance, but our primary concern is public safety." "Professor." Chun stood slowly, academic instincts warring with survival sense. "Agent Davidson, this region has significant archaeological value that extends far beyond the current emergency. Any permanent modifications could result in irreparable loss of historical knowledge. That's a concern for other agencies, Professor. Our mandate is immediate public safety and emergency response efficiency." Ryan recognized the tone. He had used it himself when dealing with civilians who didn't understand the police. Sometimes had to prioritize immediate safety over other considerations. The problem was, he was beginning to suspect that immediate safety concerns and archaeological significance might be intimately connected. "Agents, would it be possible to arrange a brief site inspection before any decisions about access restrictions?" Ryan asked. "I think you might find that historical evidence is directly relevant to ongoing safety considerations." Davidson and Rodriguez exchanged a look suggesting they had encountered this request before and had standard procedures for dealing with it. "Officer Carter, we have geological engineers and structural specialists who can assess safety-related issues. Academic speculation about historical significance isn't really within our purview." It was polite but firm dismissal, the kind Ryan recognized as bureaucratic finality. These agents had their orders and parameters, and they weren't going to be swayed by appeals to scientific curiosity. After the agents left, with stern warnings about avoiding the waterfall area until further notice, the three sat in frustrated silence. Ryan found himself thinking about the mechanical clock mechanism they had glimpsed on one of the chamber pedestals, its intricate gears and springs representing precision engineering that challenged everything historians thought they knew about medieval technology. The device had been not just functional but beautiful. its brass components still smooth and perfectly calibrated after nearly 9 centuries. "We need to make a decision," Maria said finally. "Do we comply with federal restrictions and hope proper archaeological authorities eventually get access? Or do we try to gather as much information as possible while we still can? The risk is significant," Chun pointed out. "If we're caught violating federal restrictions, we could face serious legal consequences. And any evidence we gather under those circumstances might be inadmissible in academic or legal contexts." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, thinking about implications of both choices. His police training emphasized following proper procedures and respecting jurisdictional boundaries. But his growing understanding of their discovery suggested that proper procedures might not be adequate to protect something this important. "There's a third option," he said slowly. "What if we focused on research that could be conducted away from the site itself? The symbols we photographed, historical records Professor Chun has access to, local oral traditions. We could build a case for the site's significance without violating federal restrictions." Maria looked intrigued. "You're thinking about building an academic argument strong enough to convince federal authorities that the site deserves special protection." "Something like that. If we can demonstrate that archaeological significance is directly relevant to current safety concerns, particularly if those cyclical disaster predictions have any validity, we might be able to make preservation and investigation a matter of public safety rather than just academic curiosity." Chun was nodding slowly. "It's not unprecedented. There have been cases where archaeological evidence has been used to assess geological risks, particularly in areas with histories of seismic activity. The question is whether we can build that case quickly enough," Maria said, "and whether the mechanical clock mechanism and other artifacts provide enough evidence to support our claims about advanced predictive capabilities." They spent the rest of the day on exactly that challenge, cataloging photographic evidence, researching historical precedents for advanced pre-Columbian engineering, and trying to build a coherent argument for why the tunnel complex represented not just archaeological treasure, but potentially vital information about recurring natural disasters. Ryan found the work both frustrating and fascinating. His police background had given him skills in evidence analysis and logical argument construction, but he had never applied those skills to historical mysteries. The mechanical clock mechanism, in particular, seemed to represent key evidence its sophistication suggested. Technological knowledge that went far beyond simple TIMEKEEPING. As evening approached, they had compiled a preliminary report they hoped would be compelling enough to at least delay any permanent closure of the site. But Ryan was acutely aware they were working against multiple deadlines: his recall to Sacramento, federal restrictions on site access, and the possibility that whatever cyclical event the ancient civilization had been tracking might be approaching more rapidly than any of them wanted to believe. Despite the federal restrictions, Ryan found himself unable to focus on anything but the research they had begun. His final day in the village was supposed to be spent completing official paperwork and coordinating the handover to federal emergency management. But he kept returning to the photographs and sketches Maria had made of the chamber symbols. Professor Chun had set up his laptop in the corner of the village school, cross-referencing their findings with historical databases and archaeological reports from similar sites across Central America. What he was discovering challenged conventional understanding of pre-Columbian technological development. "Ryan, you need to see this," Chum called out, his voice tight with excitement. "I've been analyzing the metal composition of that navigational instrument we photographed. Based on the visible characteristics, the lack of corrosion, the precise tolerances of the moving parts, this appears to be an alloy that we can identify with known metallurgical techniques from that period." Maria looked up from her own research. where she had been comparing the chamber's astronomical symbols to modern star charts. It gets stranger. The star positions shown in those manuscript pages, they're not just accurate for the year 1142. They're predictive. Some of these diagrams show celestial arrangements that didn't occur until decades after that date. Ryan moved to stand behind Chen's laptop, studying the comparison charts the professor had compiled. Are you saying they could predict astronomical events? I'm saying they demonstrated knowledge of celestial mechanics that European astronomy wouldn't achieve until the Renaissance, Chen replied. But there's something else, something that connects to what we found in those disaster prediction carvings. He pulled up a new screen showing overlaid historical data. I've been researching seismic and volcanic activity in this region going back as far as records exist. There's a pattern, Ryan. Major catastrophic events occurring at regular intervals, approximately every 280 to 300 years. Maria frowned, setting down her sketches. What kind of catastrophic events? Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, always in combination, always devastating, and always followed by periods of rebuilding and relative stability. The last major event was in 1751, a massive earthquake that triggered volcanic activity and coastal flooding that wiped out several communities. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. That's about 270 years ago. Exactly. And if the pattern holds, we're overdue for the next cycle. The implications settled over them like a heavy blanket. Ryan found himself thinking about the metal alloy sample they had observed in the chamber. That's strange. Uncorroding material that had maintained its structural integrity for nearly 9 centuries. The ancient civilization hadn't just predicted disasters. They had prepared for them with technology that could survive what was coming. There's more, Chung continued, pulling up another screen. I've been correlating the chamber symbols with geological surveys of this region. The tunnel system we discovered isn't random. It's positioned along specific geological features that will provide maximum protection during seismic events. Maria was studying her translations of the wall carvings with new understanding. That explains these passages about the deep shelters and the time of waiting. They weren't just trying to survive disasters. They were planning for the continuation of their civilization through multiple cycles. Before Ryan could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of someone unexpected, Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geologist from the University of Costa Rica who had been conducting research in the region before the tsunami. She was a woman in her 40s with the kind of focused intensity that Ryan associated with people who had dedicated their lives to understanding complex systems. Professor Chun, I've been looking for you, she said without preamble. I understand. You've made some discoveries that might be relevant to my research on regional seismic patterns. Chun looked uncertain about how much to reveal, but Ryan made the decision for him. Dr. Martinez, what kind of seismic patterns are you studying? Cyclical geological activity, she replied, settling into a chair and pulling out her own laptop. I've been mapping earthquake and volcanic activity in Central America for the past 15 years, and I've identified what appears to be a predictable pattern of major events. The three of them exchanged glances. What kind of predictable pattern? Maria asked carefully. Dr. Martinez opened her laptop and displayed a map of the region marked with colored indicators, showing different types of geological activity over time. Major seismic events occurring approximately every 280 years, always involving multiple simultaneous phenomena, earthquakes triggering volcanic activity, which in turn creates conditions for massive tsunamis. Have you identified what causes this pattern? Ryan asked. That's what I've been trying to understand. The timing is too regular to be coincidental, but the geological mechanisms that could create such precise cyclical behavior are poorly understood. She paused, studying their faces. I have a feeling you might have information that could help explain what I've been observing. Chung made another decision about trust. Dr. Martinez, we may have discovered evidence that suggests this cyclical pattern was known and documented by pre-Columbian civilizations in this region. Over the next hour, they shared their findings with Dr. Martinez, the photographs of the chamber, the translations of the disaster prediction carvings, the evidence of advanced astronomical and engineering knowledge. She listened with growing amazement and concern. "This changes everything," she said finally. "If this ancient civilization documented multiple cycles of these events, they might have identified the underlying geological mechanisms that we've been missing." Maria was studying the metal alloy sample photographs again. "There's something else we need to consider. This material, if it's as advanced as it appears to be, suggests they weren't just recording disasters. They were preparing for long-term survival through multiple cycles." "Which means," Ryan said slowly, "they might have left behind not just warnings, but solutions." Dr. Martinez was nodding eagerly. "If they understood the geological mechanisms well enough to predict timing, they might have developed techniques for preparation, mitigation, even survival strategies that we could adapt for modern use." The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. Ryan found himself thinking about the implications of ancient knowledge that could save lives in the present, but which was currently locked away behind federal restrictions and bureaucratic caution. "How much time do we have?" he asked Dr. Martinez. She consulted her data again, her expression growing grim. "Based on the historical pattern and current geological indicators, I estimate we're in the warning period now. Early signs of the next major cycle are already present in the seismic data." "How early?" "If the pattern holds true, we could see the beginning of major activity within months, possibly weeks." The weight of that revelation settled over all of them. They had potentially discovered ancient knowledge that could help prepare for an impending natural disaster, but they were being prevented from accessing the full extent of that knowledge by the very government agencies whose job it was to protect public safety. "We need to find a way to get back into that tunnel system," Maria said quietly. "Not for archaeological curiosity, but for immediate practical information that could save lives." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the metal alloy sample and what it represented, not just advanced metallurgy, but evidence of a civilization that had successfully prepared for and survived multiple catastrophic cycles. That knowledge could be invaluable for modern disaster preparation, but only if they could access it in time. "Dr. Martinez," he said finally, "how quickly could you prepare a geological assessment that would justify emergency access to the site?" "If I had support from colleagues and access to recent seismic data, possibly within days." "Then that's what we're going to do," Ryan decided. "We're going to build a case so compelling that federal authorities will have to choose between academic caution and public safety." The question was whether they could work fast enough and whether the ancient warnings they had discovered would prove accurate in ways that none of them were prepared for. 3 days after Ryan's official recall to Sacramento, he was still in Bahia Perdita, having used every bureaucratic maneuver he could think of to extend his stay. He had cited ongoing safety concerns, requested vacation time, and finally claimed a family emergency that required him to remain in the region. His supervisor wasn't pleased, but Ryan had enough accumulated goodwill and clean service record to buy himself additional time. Dr. Martinez had been true to her word, working with colleagues from universities across Central America to compile a comprehensive geological assessment of the region. What they had discovered was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The ancient seismic detection device that Ryan's team had photographed in the chamber appeared to be based on principles that modern seismology was only beginning to understand. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez said, spreading geological surveys across the table in what had become their unofficial headquarters in the village school. "The tunnel system we discovered isn't just positioned for protection. During earthquakes, it's designed to function as a massive seismographic instrument. Professor Chun looked up from his translation work, where he had been trying to decode more of the chamber's warning inscriptions. What do you mean by that? The positioning, the depth, the way the tunnels are oriented. They're essentially creating a three-dimensional sensor array that could detect and measure seismic activity with extraordinary precision. Dr. Martinez traced her finger along the topographical maps. If I'm reading the geological indicators correctly, this ancient civilization built what amounts to an early warning system that could predict major earthquakes days or even weeks before they occur. Maria was studying photographs of the seismic detection device itself, trying to understand how something that looked like carved stone and metal could function as sophisticated monitoring equipment. The device consisted of several concentric rings of different materials, with delicate indicators that appeared to respond to minute changes in ground movement. The inscriptions around the device described listening to the Earth's voice. She said, "I initially thought that was metaphorical, but what if they meant it literally? What if this instrument could actually detect the kinds of precursor activity that modern seismology looks for?" Ryan found himself drawn to the implications of what they were discovering. His police background had taught him to look for patterns, to recognize when seemingly unrelated events were actually part of a larger picture. The seismic detection device represented exactly that kind of pattern recognition, the ability to see connections that weren't immediately obvious. "Dr. Martinez, are you seeing any of those precursor indicators now?" he asked Dot. Her expression grew grave. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with all of you. Over the past week, I've been monitoring seismic activity throughout the region, using both modern instruments and the principles we've learned from studying the ancient device. What I'm seeing is consistent with the early stages of a major seismic event." "How major?" Chun asked quietly. "If the historical pattern holds true, potentially catastrophic. The kind of event that could trigger secondary disasters, volcanic activity, landslides, tsunamis. The recent tsunami that brought us all here might have been just the beginning." The weight of that revelation settled over them. Ryan thought about the hundreds of people still living in the region, many of them in temporary shelters that wouldn't survive a major earthquake. The federal emergency management teams were focused on cleanup and basic infrastructure repair, not preparation for an even larger disaster. "We need to get this information to the authorities," Maria said. "People need to be warned, evacuated if necessary." "The problem is credibility," Dr. Martinez replied. "I can present the geological data, but when I start talking about insights gained from studying ancient seismic instruments, I lose most of my scientific audience. The federal agencies want concrete, verified data from recognized sources." Ryan was studying the photographs of the chamber carvings that seemed to describe evacuation procedures and survival protocols. What if we focused on the practical information rather than the historical significance? Those wall carvings aren't just recording disasters. They're describing specific steps for preparation and response. Chun nodded thoughtfully. "Maria has been translating sections that appear to be detailed instructions for recognizing warning signs, preparing shelters, organizing community response. If we could demonstrate that these ancient protocols are consistent with modern emergency management principles, we might be able to get people to listen to the practical advice without having to convince them about the historical authenticity." Maria finished. They spent the rest of the day working on exactly that approach, extracting the practical emergency preparedness information from the ancient inscriptions and correlating it with modern disaster response protocols. What they found was remarkable. The ancient civilization had developed comprehensive strategies for earthquake prediction, community evacuation, and post-disaster survival that in many ways surpassed contemporary emergency planning. The seismic detection device was central to their system. Based on Maria's translations and Dr. Martinez's geological analysis, the instrument could detect the kinds of subtle ground movements and atmospheric changes that preceded major earthquakes. More importantly, the surrounding inscriptions described how to interpret those signals and how much time communities typically had to prepare once certain indicators appeared. According to this, Maria said, pointing to a section of wall carving she had been working on, there are 3 stages of warning. The first stage can occur weeks before a major event: subtle changes in underground water flow, minor tremors in specific patterns, even changes in animal behavior. We're seeing all of those indicators now, Dr. Martinez said grimly. Which means, if this system is accurate, we're already in the first warning stage. Ryan felt his pulse quicken. What about the second and third stages? Second stage involves more obvious seismic activity, stronger tremors, visible changes in the landscape, water sources changing temperature or flow rate. According to the inscriptions, this stage typically lasts 3 to 7 days. And the third stage? Immediate precursors. The inscriptions describe the Earth's final warning, specific seismic patterns that occur in the hours immediately before catastrophic events. Dr. Martinez was checking her latest data on her laptop, her face growing pale. If I'm interpreting the ancient indicators correctly in relation to what we're currently observing, we may be approaching the transition between first and second stage warning periods. The implications were staggering. They potentially had access to an early warning system that could save thousands of lives, but they were prevented from fully accessing or testing that system by federal restrictions on the tunnel site. We need to make a decision, Ryan said. Do we try to work within official channels and risk running out of time? Or do we find a way to access the tunnel system directly and gather the information we need to warn people? Professor Chun was quiet for a long moment. There's something else we need to consider. Those inscriptions don't just describe how to recognize warnings. They describe how the ancient civilization survived multiple cycles of catastrophic events. They didn't just predict disasters. They developed sustainable strategies for rebuilding and maintaining their knowledge through repeated catastrophes. Which means, Maria said slowly, they faced this exact situation multiple times. They dealt with the choice between following established authorities and taking direct action to save lives. Ryan found himself thinking about the responsibilities that came with knowledge about the difference between following rules and doing what was right. His police training emphasized working within systems and respecting authority, but it also emphasized protecting people from harm when possible. Dr. Martinez, how much time do you think we have before we reach this second warning stage? He asked. She consulted her data again. Based on current seismic patterns and the ancient indicators we've been studying, possibly days, maybe a week at most. And once we reach the second stage, if the historical pattern is accurate, we would have less than a week before the catastrophic event itself. Ryan looked around at the 3 people who had become his closest collaborators in this extraordinary discovery. They had stumbled onto knowledge that could save lives, but using that knowledge would require them to make choices that went far beyond their individual comfort zones. Then, we don't have time for proper channels and bureaucratic approval, he said finally. We need to find a way to get back into that tunnel system, document everything we can about the ancient warning and survival protocols, and find a way to warn people whether the authorities want to listen or not. The question was whether they could work fast enough, and whether the ancient seismic detection device would prove as accurate as the civilization that built it believed it to be. The decision to violate federal restrictions wasn't made lightly, but the mounting evidence of impending seismic activity left them little choice. Ryan had spent his career respecting authority and following proper procedures, but he had also sworn an oath to protect people from harm. Sometimes those 2 obligations came into conflict, and when they did, His choice was clear. They planned their return to the tunnel for the pre-dawn hours, when federal patrols would be minimal and the waterfall's natural sound would mask any noise they might make. Dr. Martinez had brought additional geological monitoring equipment, portable seismographs and electromagnetic sensors that could provide real-time data about the tunnel's function as a seismic detection system. The approach to Whispering Falls felt different this time. There was an urgency to their movement that hadn't been present during their earlier explorations, a sense that they were racing against time and events beyond their control. The early morning mist rising from the jungle gave everything an ethereal quality that seemed appropriate for what they were attempting. The electromagnetic readings are already anomalous, Dr. Martinez whispered as they approached the waterfall. There's some kind of energy field associated with the tunnel system that doesn't match anything in the geological literature. Professor Chen was carrying additional photography equipment and measurement tools, determined to document everything they could access during what might be their only opportunity for comprehensive study. The energy readings could explain how the seismic detection system functions. If the tunnel network is somehow channeling or amplifying natural electromagnetic fields, it would create a monitoring system far more sensitive than anything we currently understand, Maria finished. She had brought translation materials for the more complex inscriptions they hadn't been able to study thoroughly during their first visit. Getting behind the waterfall was routine now, but entering the tunnel felt like crossing into forbidden territory. The federal restrictions weren't just bureaucratic inconvenience violating. Them could result in serious legal consequences for all of them. Ryan found himself thinking about the implications for his law enforcement career. But those concerns seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of preventing a catastrophe. The tunnel seemed different somehow as they moved deeper into the mountain. Dr. Martinez's electromagnetic sensors were registering readings that grew stronger with each step, suggesting that whatever energy source powered the ancient detection system was still active after nearly 9 centuries. "This is impossible," Dr. Martinez said, studying her instruments. "The energy levels I'm detecting would require some kind of power source, but there's no indication of what that could be." When they reached the main chamber, they immediately saw something that had been hidden during their previous visits. In the improved lighting from their more powerful equipment, additional passages were visible leading deeper into the mountain. But more importantly, one of the pedestals that had appeared empty before now clearly held an object that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The energy storage crystal was approximately the size of a dinner plate and perhaps 3 inches thick, with a translucent quality that seemed to shift between different colors as they watched. Most remarkably, it appeared to be generating the electromagnetic field that Dr. Martinez's instruments were detecting. "Professor Chun, are you seeing this?" Ryan asked, approaching the crystal carefully. "I'm seeing it, but I don't understand." Chun replied, his voice filled with awe. "This appears to be some kind of power generation or storage system, but based on principles we don't recognize." Maria was studying the inscriptions around the crystal's pedestal, her translation efforts taking on new urgency. "The symbols here are talking about the heart of the earth's voice and the eternal flame that listens. I think this crystal is the power source for the entire seismic detection network." Dr. Martinez was taking readings from multiple angles, her equipment registering energy outputs that shouldn't be possible from any known mineral or crystalline formation. The electromagnetic signature is unlike anything in the scientific literature. If this crystal is actually generating power rather than just storing it, it represents a completely unknown form of energy production. As they worked to document the crystal and understand its function, they began to notice that other artifacts in the chamber were responding to their presence. The seismic detection device was showing increased activity, its metal rings moving in subtle patterns that seemed to correlate with Dr. Martinez's readings of current geological conditions. The entire system is interconnected, Chen observed. The crystal provides power. The detection device monitors seismic activity, and the inscriptions on the walls provide interpretation and instruction. It's a complete early warning and disaster response system. Maria had found a section of wall carvings that appeared to describe the crystal's properties and function. According to this, the crystal doesn't just generate power. It somehow draws energy from the same geological forces that create earthquakes and volcanic activity. It's literally powered by the Earth's seismic energy, which would explain why it's still functioning after 9 centuries, Dr. Martinez said. If it draws power from geological activity, and this region has continuous low-level seismic activity, it would have an essentially unlimited power source. Ryan was studying the way the crystal's light seemed to pulse in rhythm with the seismic detection device's movements. Is it possible that this system is not just monitoring earthquake activity, but actually drawing power from it? More than possible, Dr. Martinez replied, checking her instruments again. The energy readings I'm getting suggest that this crystal is essentially a geological power plant, converting seismic energy into usable power for the monitoring and warning systems. The implications were staggering. The ancient civilization hadn't just developed sophisticated earthquake prediction methods. They had created a sustainable technology that used the Earth's own energy to power their survival systems. It was a level of environmental integration and technological sophistication that challenged everything they thought they knew about ancient capabilities. But as they worked to document the crystal and its function, Dr. Martinez's geological monitoring equipment began registering increased seismic activity throughout the region. The transition to the second warning stage that they had been anticipating was beginning to occur. The pattern is accelerating, she said, her voice tense with concern. Based on these readings and the historical data, we're moving into the second stage faster than I expected. Maria was translating more of the warning inscriptions, her expression growing increasingly troubled. The symbols here describe specific preparations that need to be made during the second stage evacuation of vulnerable areas, protection of essential resources, activation of the deep shelters. Deep shelters? Ryan asked. It sounds like they had prepared underground facilities designed to protect people during the catastrophic events. Not just this chamber, but a network of connected shelters that could house significant populations. Chun was studying the chamber more carefully, looking for evidence of these additional shelter systems. If this chamber is part of a larger network, there should be additional passages, connection points, areas designed for extended habitation. As they explored the chamber more thoroughly, they found exactly what Chun had predicted: additional tunnels leading deeper into the mountain, carved with the same precision as the main passage, but clearly designed for different purposes. Some appeared to lead to storage areas, others to what might have been living quarters, and still others to chambers whose purpose wasn't immediately clear. The energy storage crystal seemed to be the central power source for this entire underground complex, providing light, ventilation, and power for systems they were only beginning to understand. But most importantly, it was still functioning perfectly, still drawing power from the Earth's seismic activity, still ready to support the ancient civilization's survival protocols. We need to get this information to the authorities immediately, Ryan said. Not just the earthquake predictions, but the existence of these shelter systems. If the ancient warnings are accurate, these tunnels might be the key to surviving what's coming. Dr. Martinez was packing up her equipment, her readings, showing continued acceleration of seismic activity. Based on current patterns, we have perhaps 3 to 4 days before we reach the third and final warning stage. And then? Maria asked. Then we find out whether 900 years of ancient warnings prove accurate in ways that none of us are prepared for. As they made their way back through the tunnel toward the waterfall, the energy storage crystal continued to pulse behind them, a beacon of ancient wisdom still functioning perfectly after centuries of waiting. The question was whether modern civilization would prove as adaptable and prepared as the one that had created this remarkable survival system. The discovery they made in the deepest chamber of the tunnel network changed everything, Ryan thought. He understood about the ancient civilization and their disappearance. Following passages that led further into the mountain than they had imagined possible, the team had found what could only be described as a vast underground city chambers, corridors, living spaces, and storage areas that could have housed thousands of people. But it was the warning monument in the central chamber that stopped them all. In their tracks, the stone tablet was massive, perhaps 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, covered with inscriptions that were more detailed and comprehensive than anything they had found before. As Maria worked to translate the symbols, her voice grew increasingly stunned by what she was reading. "This isn't the record of a civilization that disappeared," she said, her words echoing in the vast chamber. "This is a record of a civilization that made a deliberate choice to hide." Professor Chun was examining the craftsmanship of the monument itself, which showed the same impossible precision they had seen throughout the tunnel system. "What do you mean by chose to hide?" Maria pointed to specific sections of the inscription, a translation revealing a story that none of them had anticipated. According to this, the civilization didn't vanish in 1142. That was when they went underground, permanently. They retreated into these tunnel systems and sealed themselves away from the surface world. "Why would they do that?" Ryan asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer wouldn't be simple. "Because they understood something about the cyclical disasters that we haven't grasped yet," Maria replied, continuing to work through the complex inscriptions. "The catastrophic events aren't just natural phenomena. They're part of a larger pattern that includes human behavior, environmental degradation, and societal collapse." Dr. Martinez was taking readings throughout the chamber, her geological instruments registering the same sophisticated energy systems they had found throughout the complex. "Are you saying they predicted not just earthquakes and volcanic activity, but the collapse of their own civilization?" "More than predicted. They engineered their survival through it," Chun said, studying architectural features that suggested the underground city had been designed for long-term habitation. "Look at the ventilation systems, the water management, the agricultural spaces. This wasn't built as a temporary shelter. It was built as a permanent alternative to surface civilization." As they explored more of the underground city, the scope of what the ancient civilization had accomplished became increasingly clear. They had created a completely sustainable underground society, powered by geothermal and seismic energy, supplied with fresh water from underground sources, and equipped with agricultural systems that could support large populations indefinitely. But, most remarkably, they had continued to monitor and document the surface world through the centuries, maintaining detailed records of the cyclical disasters and their effects on subsequent civilizations. "Ryan, you need to see this," Maria called from a chamber lined with what appeared to be carved stone books. Thousands of volumes recording observations, predictions, and analyses spanning centuries. The warning monument described the pattern they had discovered. Every 280 to 300 years, the region experienced not just geological catastrophes, but complete societal breakdown. The earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis were just the beginning. What followed was famine, disease, conflict over scarce resources, and the collapse of political and social structures. They realized that surface civilizations were fundamentally vulnerable, Maria translated, not just to natural disasters, but to the human responses to those disasters. So they created an alternative, a sustainable underground civilization that could survive both the natural catastrophes and the societal collapse that followed them. Dr. Martinez was studying geological charts carved into the chamber walls, comparing them to her modern understanding of regional tectonics. This is extraordinary. They map geological patterns across a much larger area than we initially understood. This cyclical activity isn't limited to this immediate region. It affects the entire Pacific coastal zone of Central America. Which means, Chun said slowly, the disaster we're predicting isn't just a local event. If their historical pattern is accurate, we're looking at a regional catastrophe that could affect millions of people. Ryan found himself staring at the warning monument, trying to process the implications of what they were learning. The ancient civilization hadn't disappeared. They had evolved, creating a sustainable way of life that could survive repeated catastrophes while maintaining their knowledge and culture. Is it possible they're still here? He asked quietly. The question hung in the air as they all considered its implications. The underground city showed signs of recent maintenance. The energy systems were still perfectly functional, and some of the agricultural areas looked as if they could still be in use. The inscription suggests that descendants of the original civilization have maintained the underground cities through multiple disaster cycles, Maria said, her voice filled with awe and uncertainty. They've been down here for nearly 900 years, preserving knowledge, monitoring the surface world, and preparing for the next cycle. Before anyone could respond to that revelation, they heard something that made them all freeze, footsteps echoing from deeper in the tunnel system. Not the random sounds of settling stone or dripping water, but the deliberate rhythm of people moving through the passages with purpose and familiarity. We're not alone down here, Chun whispered. The footsteps grew closer, and soon they could see lights approaching, not modern flashlights, but the steady glow of what appeared to be the same energy-based illumination they had seen throughout the complex. As the lights drew nearer, they could make out figures, people dressed in practical clothing that looked both ancient and timeless, moving with the confident familiarity of those who belonged in this environment. The leader of the group was an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that held the depth of someone who had spent a lifetime studying patterns that most people never noticed. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire communities. We have been watching your progress through our monitoring systems, she said in accented but clear English. We know why you are here, and we know what you have discovered about the approaching cycle. Ryan found his voice first. How long have you been down here? Our families have maintained these cities since the Great Retreat in 1142, she replied. We are the descendants of those who chose to survive by adapting rather than by fighting forces beyond their control. And you've been monitoring the surface world all this time? Maria asked. The woman nodded. It is our responsibility to preserve knowledge through the dark periods, and to provide guidance when surface civilizations are ready to learn from our experience. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her shock. The disaster cycle we've been predicting, how accurate are our projections? Very accurate, the woman replied grimly. You have learned to read the early warning signs correctly. The third stage will begin within days, and the catastrophic events will follow soon after. What can we do? Ryan asked. How do we warn people? How do we prepare? The woman studied them for a long moment, as if assessing their readiness for what she was about to say. That depends on whether surface civilization is ready to accept truths that challenge everything they believe about progress, technology, and the relationship between human society and natural forces. She gestured toward the warning monument and the vast underground city surrounding them. We offer not just warnings about what is coming, but a model for how to survive it. But accepting our guidance requires abandoning the illusion that surface civilization can simply rebuild the same systems that failed during previous cycles. You're talking about fundamental changes to how society organizes itself, Chun said, understanding the implications. We are talking about choosing between adaptation and extinction, the woman replied. Your surface civilization is approaching the same crossroads that ours faced in 1142. You can continue the cycle of building, being destroyed, and rebuilding the same vulnerable systems, or you can learn to live in harmony with the forces that shape this region. Ryan looked around at the sustainable technology, the sophisticated early warning systems, the evidence of a civilization that had successfully survived multiple catastrophic cycles. You're offering to share 900 years of accumulated knowledge about disaster survival and sustainable technology. We are offering to fulfill the purpose for which our ancestors created these cities, the woman confirmed. To preserve knowledge through the dark times and to guide the next awakening of surface civilization toward more sustainable approaches. The magnitude of what was being offered was staggering. Not just warnings about impending disaster, but access to alternative technologies and social systems that could transform how human societies related to their environment. But as Ryan looked at his companions, he realized that accepting this knowledge would require them to become advocates for changes that most people would find impossible to believe or accept. They would have to convince modern civilization to abandon approaches that seemed rational and adopt alternatives based on the wisdom of people who had supposedly vanished centuries ago. The question was whether they could build that bridge between ancient wisdom and modern need quickly enough to make a difference. When the catastrophic cycle reached its completion, the woman who had introduced herself as Elder Alana led them deeper into the underground city, revealing systems and knowledge that challenged everything Ryan thought he understood about technology, society, and human adaptation. What they were being shown wasn't just advanced engineering, it was a completely different approach to civilization itself. The evacuation plan codex that your Dr. Martinez has been seeking is not just a document, Alana explained as they walked through corridors lined with carved instructions and diagrams. It is a comprehensive protocol developed over multiple disaster cycles, refined through centuries of experience with catastrophic events and their aftermath. The codex itself was carved into an entire chamber wall, its symbols and diagrams providing detailed instructions for mass population relocation, resource management, and survival protocols that could sustain thousands of people through extended crisis periods. But what made it truly remarkable was its integration with the underground city systems. It wasn't just theoretical knowledge, but practical guidance based on repeated implementation. How many people could these systems support? Dr. Martinez asked, studying the infrastructure with her geologist's eye for practical considerations. In full emergency mode, approximately 15,000 people for up to 2 years, Alana replied. But that assumes careful resource management and strict adherence to the sustainability protocols we have developed. Ryan found himself grappling with the logistical implications of what they were discussing. 15,000 people. That's more than the entire current population of this region. You're talking about evacuating people from a much larger area. The seismic activity you have been monitoring affects the entire Pacific coastal zone, Alana confirmed. When the full cycle completes, the catastrophic events will impact communities from Guatemala to Panama. Our evacuation protocols account for that regional scope. Professor Chun was examining the codex more closely, trying to understand how ancient knowledge could be applied to modern populations with modern expectations and dependencies. The challenge isn't just physical shelter, he observed. Modern people are dependent on electrical systems, processed foods, complex supply chains. How do you integrate contemporary populations with sustainable survival systems? That is precisely the question your surface civilization must answer, Alana replied. Our ancestors faced the same challenge in 1142. How to maintain human dignity and community structure while adapting to radically different circumstances. As they moved through the underground city, Ryan began to understand the scope of what the hidden civilization had accomplished. They had created not just survival systems, but a complete alternative society that had evolved over centuries while maintaining its core knowledge and values. Agricultural chambers produced food using geothermal energy and carefully managed water systems. Workshops maintained and improved tools and technology using renewable resources. Living areas balanced individual privacy with community cooperation. Most importantly, they had maintained educational systems that preserved both practical skills and historical knowledge, ensuring that each generation understood both how to survive catastrophic cycles and why those cycles occurred. The key insight our ancestors developed, Alana explained as they paused in what appeared to be a central planning chamber, was understanding that catastrophic cycles are not just geological phenomena. They are tests of societal resilience. Civilizations that build rigid, centralized systems always fail during crisis periods. Only adaptive, decentralized communities survive. Dr. Martinez was taking extensive notes, her scientific training helping her understand the practical applications of what they were learning. You're describing a fundamentally different approach to technology and social organization. Instead of trying to control natural forces, you've learned to work with them. Control is an illusion, Alana replied. The Earth's forces are far too powerful for any human technology to control. But adaptation and cooperation, those allow survival and even flourishing through any circumstance. The Evacuation Plan Codex included specific protocols for integrating surface populations with underground systems during crisis periods. But it also included something more challenging: blueprints for rebuilding surface communities using sustainable principles that could survive future cycles. Surface civilizations always make the same mistakes, Alana continued. They build in vulnerable locations, depend on resource extraction that depletes their environment, create social hierarchies that break down under stress. Then, when disasters strike, they rebuild using the same approaches that guaranteed their vulnerability. Ryan was studying sections of the Codex that described leadership structures during crisis periods, protocols for decision-making, resource allocation, and conflict resolution that prioritize community survival over individual advantage. These systems require people to trust each other in ways that modern society doesn't really prepare them for. Which is why the transition period is so critical, Alana said. People must learn new ways of thinking and cooperating before the crisis reaches its peak. Once the catastrophic events begin, there is no time for adjustment or adaptation. The magnitude of what they were contemplating became clearer as they continued through the city. They weren't just planning to warn people about an approaching disaster. They were potentially catalyzing a fundamental transformation of how human communities organized themselves and related to their environment. But time was running short. Dr. Martinez's instruments continued to register acceleration in seismic activity, and Alana's own monitoring systems confirmed that the transition to the third and final warning stage was imminent. "How long do we have?" Ryan asked as they gathered in the planning chamber to discuss immediate next steps. "Based on current geological indicators, perhaps 72 hours before the catastrophic events begin," Alana replied, "which means we have at most 48 hours to implement evacuation protocols for people who have never heard of our systems and may not believe they exist." Maria was studying the sections of the Codex that dealt with communication and persuasion during crisis periods. There are protocols here for gaining community trust quickly, for demonstrating the credibility of the warning systems, for organizing rapid response to large-scale threats. But they assume cooperation from local leaders and institutions, Chung pointed out. "We're dealing with federal agencies that have already restricted access to this site, local officials who don't understand the scope of the threat, and populations that have no reason to trust warnings about ancient disaster cycles," Ryan found. himself thinking about the practical realities of law enforcement and emergency response. We need to work through official channels where possible, but we also need backup plans for when official channels fail or move too slowly. Alana was nodding approvingly. Our ancestors faced similar challenges, convincing people to abandon familiar systems and adopt unfamiliar approaches under time pressure. The Codex includes strategies for both official cooperation and grassroots organization. Over the next several hours, they developed a multi-pronged approach that combined modern emergency management protocols with ancient survival wisdom. Dr. Martinez would present the geological evidence to federal emergency agencies, emphasizing the scientific validity of the disaster predictions. Professor Chun would work with academic networks to build scholarly support for the historical authenticity of the warning systems. Maria would coordinate with local community leaders to explain the practical evacuation protocols. Ryan would use his law enforcement credentials to interface with official agencies, while quietly organizing backup systems for rapid population movement if official channels proved inadequate. But perhaps most importantly, Alana and her people would begin activating the underground city's emergency protocols, preparing the shelter systems to receive large numbers of surface dwellers who would need to adapt quickly to completely unfamiliar survival systems. "There's one more thing you need to understand," Alana said as they finalized their plans. "The evacuation protocols are not just about surviving the catastrophic events themselves. They are about preserving knowledge and community structures. Through the chaos that follows, the famines, conflicts, and social breakdown that occur when centralized systems collapse." "How long does that typically last?" Ryan asked. "But based on historical patterns, 5 to 10 years before stable surface communities can be re-established. Which means the people we evacuate to the underground cities must be prepared for extended stays and must learn to contribute to sustainable systems rather than simply consuming resources." The implications were staggering. They weren't just planning emergency shelter. They were potentially facilitating the largest intentional social transformation in modern history. But looking around at the sophisticated systems the hidden civilization had maintained for 9 centuries, Ryan realized it might also represent the best hope for human survival through whatever was coming. The question was whether they could build bridges between two completely different approaches to civilization quickly, enough to matter when the Earth's forces reached their cyclical peak. The third stage warning signs began appearing exactly as the ancient Codex had predicted subtle changes in underground energy patterns that Dr. Martinez's instruments detected first, followed by shifts in the seismic detection device that suggested imminent catastrophic activity. Ryan stood in the underground city's central communication hub, watching Alana and her people activate systems that had been maintained for centuries, but never fully used. The communication network hub was a marvel of ancient engineering, a central device that coordinated information flow throughout the entire underground complex and connected to monitoring stations across the region. "The network is confirming geological activity at 17 monitoring points," Alana reported, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. "The pattern matches historical records for the hours immediately preceding major catastrophic events." Above ground, their warning efforts had met with mixed results. Dr. Martinez had succeeded in getting federal emergency agencies to take the geological threat seriously, but bureaucratic response focused on gradual evacuation, procedures that would take weeks to implement. They had perhaps 12 hours. Professor Chun's academic contacts had provided scholarly validation, but translating that into immediate action by local authorities was proving impossible within their time constraints. Maria's outreach to community leaders had been more successful. Many local families had traditional knowledge that made them more receptive to warnings about ancient disaster cycles. Ryan's law enforcement background was proving most valuable. His credibility with emergency services and understanding of rapid response protocols had enabled him to quietly organize evacuation networks that could move people quickly when official systems proved too slow. Status report from surface teams. Ryan said, consulting radio communications they had established. Federal Emergency Management is beginning evacuation of the immediate coastal zone, but they're estimating 48 hours for full implementation. Dr. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. They don't understand the regional scope of what we're facing. Local community response is better, came Maria's report. Families with traditional knowledge are taking warnings seriously and beginning to move to higher ground. But we need shelter systems active if we're going to accommodate everyone who's responding. The communication network hub was designed exactly for this coordination challenge. As Alana explained its function, Ryan began to understand how the Pukuskalan, ancient civilization, had managed complex regional evacuations during previous disaster cycles. The device creates a communication network that connects all underground shelter systems across the region, she said, indicating carved panels showing locations of multiple underground cities throughout Central America. During crisis periods, it coordinates resource sharing, population distribution, and information flow between communities separated by damaged surface transportation. How many shelter systems are we talking about? Ryan asked. 43 active sites, with capacity for approximately 600,000 people total, Alana replied. But activation requires coordination between surface warning efforts and underground preparation. The network's sophistication was staggering. It included real-time monitoring of geological conditions, resource availability, and population movements across the entire region. Most remarkably, it was all powered by the same geothermal and seismic energy systems they had discovered. As reports continued from surface teams, Ryan found himself coordinating crisis response that spanned multiple countries and involved technologies that weren't supposed to exist. The Communication Network Hub provided capabilities that surpassed modern emergency management systems. The geological indicators are accelerating faster than expected, Dr. Martinez reported from her coastal monitoring station. I'm registering seismic activity that suggests catastrophic events could begin within hours rather than the 12-hour timeline we expected. Alana confirmed the assessment using ancient monitoring systems. The pattern is consistent with rapid onset scenarios, documented in our historical records. We need to initiate immediate evacuation protocols for anyone willing to respond to warnings. The next several hours became coordinated activity unlike anything Ryan had experienced. Using the Communication Network Hub, they coordinated evacuation efforts across a region spanning hundreds of miles, directing families and communities to shelter systems that most had never heard of. The ancient evacuation protocols proved remarkably effective for people willing to follow them. Local community leaders who understood traditional knowledge about disaster cycles were able to guide their people to gathering points where Alana's people provided transportation to underground shelter systems. We have approximately 3,000 people en route to various shelter systems, Maria reported as afternoon wore on. But that's a fraction of the population that could be affected if geological projections are accurate. The communication network is detecting increased seismic activity throughout the region, Alana added, monitoring displays showing real-time geological conditions across Central America. Multiple fault systems are showing signs of coordinated activity, the kind of pattern that precedes the most severe catastrophic cycles. Ryan found himself making decisions about resource allocation and population movement that would have been impossible without the ancient network systems. The communication hub provided information about shelter capacity, transportation routes, and resource availability that enabled coordination on a scale that modern emergency management couldn't match. But perhaps most challenging was the human element convincing people to abandon familiar surroundings and trust survival systems that challenged everything they thought. They knew about technology and community organization. As evening approached, geological warning signs reached the critical threshold described in the ancient codex. Seismic detection devices throughout the network were registering patterns, indicating imminent catastrophic events, massive earthquakes that would trigger volcanic activity and coastal tsunamis, far more severe than the recent disaster that had first brought Ryan to the region. "This is it." Dr. Martinez's voice came through the communication network, tense with scientific fascination and human fear. "All monitoring stations are confirming we're in the final hours before the catastrophic cycle completes." Ryan looked around the communication hub, where ancient technology was coordinating crisis response spanning multiple countries and involving thousands of people. They had achieved more than he had thought possible, warning significant numbers of people, activating shelter systems that could preserve knowledge and community through whatever was coming. But they had also learned that modern civilization's response to warnings about cyclical disasters was limited by institutional inertia, bureaucratic caution, and fundamental assumptions about technology that made rapid adaptation difficult. The question now was whether the people they had managed to warn and evacuate would prove adaptable enough to survive not just the immediate catastrophic events, but the extended period of societal disruption that ancient records suggested would follow. The catastrophic events began at 3:17 a.m. with a sequence of earthquakes that felt like the earth itself was awakening from centuries of slumber. Ryan felt the first tremor through the stone floors of the underground city, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the planet's core rather than the shallow fault movements he had experienced during smaller seismic events. In the communication hub, the ancient monitoring systems came alive with activity that surpassed anything they had witnessed during their preparation phase. The legacy vault key, the final artifact that Alana had shown them just hours before, was now actively coordinating the complete record of the ancient civilization's knowledge as it related to surviving exactly this kind of catastrophic cycle. All monitoring stations are reporting simultaneous seismic activity, Alana announced, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The pattern is consistent with the most severe cycles in our historical records. The legacy vault key was more than just a repository of ancient knowledge. It was an active coordination system that integrated centuries of disaster survival experience with real-time monitoring of current conditions. As the seismic events intensified, the device began displaying information that helped coordinate response efforts across the entire network of underground cities above ground. The modern world was experiencing geological forces that challenged every assumption about disaster preparedness. Dr. Martinez's voice came through the communication network, strained but professional as she reported from her monitoring station. The earthquake sequence is triggering volcanic activity at multiple sites along the Pacific Ring of Fire, she reported. We're seeing coordinated geological activity across a region spanning from Guatemala to Panama, exactly as the ancient records predicted. Ryan found himself coordinating crisis response efforts that spanned multiple countries while standing in a chamber carved from living rock nearly 1,000 years ago. The legacy vault key provided access to survival protocols that had been tested and refined through multiple catastrophic cycles, giving them capabilities that no modern emergency management system could match. "Evacuation status report," he called out, using the communication network to check on the thousands of people they had managed to warn and relocate to underground shelter systems. Shelter System 7 reports full capacity with 847 people successfully evacuated from coastal communities, came one report. Resources adequate for extended stay. Morale stable despite unusual circumstances. Shelter System 15 has received 1,200 people from mountain communities affected by volcanic activity, came another. Integration proceeding according to ancient protocols. Leadership structures adapting to collective decision-making requirements. What was most remarkable about the ancient survival systems was their integration of practical disaster response with social adaptation protocols. The legacy vault key didn't just provide information about structural engineering and resource management. It included detailed guidance about helping modern people adapt to community-based survival approaches that prioritized collective welfare over individual convenience. As the geological events intensified throughout the morning, Ryan watched the ancient civilization's descendants implement crisis management protocols that had been developed and refined over centuries. Their response to catastrophic disasters wasn't just about surviving immediate physical threats, it was about maintaining human dignity and community structure through extended periods of disruption and uncertainty. The key insight that our ancestors developed, Alana explained as they worked through the crisis coordination, was understanding that catastrophic cycles test not just physical survival capabilities, but social and psychological resilience. Communities that maintain cooperation and mutual support can survive circumstances that destroy individualistic societies. The legacy vault key was demonstrating exactly that principle in real time. As reports came in from shelter systems across the region, it became clear that the ancient protocols were enabling rapid adaptation to crisis conditions by people who had never experienced anything like the underground survival systems. Shelter System 23 reports successful integration of 650 surface dwellers with established underground community. Came one update. Traditional knowledge holders serving as cultural bridges, modern technical skills contributing to system improvements. Shelter System 9 has activated agricultural protocols to support extended stay for 890 people. Came another. Geothermal systems providing adequate power and climate control. Water management systems functioning at full capacity. But perhaps most importantly, the legacy vault key was coordinating the preservation of knowledge and cultural continuity that would be essential for rebuilding surface communities once the catastrophic cycle completed. The device served as both crisis management tool and cultural preservation system, ensuring that the wisdom gained through surviving the disaster would be available for future generations. As afternoon arrived and the geological events reached their peak intensity, Ryan realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern history: the successful implementation of disaster survival protocols that treated catastrophic cycles as natural phenomena to be adapted to rather than unfortunate events to be simply endured. Surface condition reports indicate that coastal areas have experienced tsunami activity consistent with historical patterns. Dr. Martinez reported, volcanic eruptions are affecting transportation and communication infrastructure across the region, but underground shelter systems remain fully functional and are successfully supporting populations that would otherwise be completely vulnerable. The transformation in Ryan's own understanding was as profound as the geological forces reshaping the landscape above them. He had begun this experience as a police officer conducting routine disaster response, but he was completing it as someone who understood that human survival required fundamental changes in how societies organized themselves and related to natural forces. The legacy vault key is recording our current experience, Alana explained as the crisis management activities continued around them. Everything we learn about integrating modern populations with ancient survival systems becomes part of the knowledge base for future cycles. As evening approached and the immediate intensity of the catastrophic events began to stabilize, Ryan found himself contemplating the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had not just survived a regional disaster. They had demonstrated that alternative approaches to technology, community organization, and environmental relationship could be effective even under the most extreme circumstances. The Legacy Vault Key represented the culmination of centuries of accumulated wisdom about human adaptation and survival. But more than that, it represented a gift from one civilization to another, a complete archive of knowledge about sustainable technology, community cooperation, and disaster resilience that could transform how future societies prepared for and responded to catastrophic cycles. The question now was what they would do with that knowledge once they returned to a surface world that had been fundamentally changed by geological forces that wouldn't be denied. 6 months after the catastrophic cycle had completed its ancient pattern, Ryan stood once again at Whispering Falls, but the landscape around him had been transformed in ways that went far beyond the geological changes wrought by earthquakes and volcanic activity. The waterfall still cascaded down the rock face, but now it was part of a carefully managed system that provided power and water for a surface community that blended ancient wisdom with modern knowledge. The time capsule collection that Alana's people had finally shared represented the complete archive of their civilizations. 900-year journey, not just technical knowledge about survival systems, but cultural wisdom about maintaining human dignity and community cooperation through extended periods of crisis and adaptation. What had emerged from the underground cities wasn't just disaster survivors, but the foundation for a fundamentally different approach to human civilization. The integration has exceeded our most optimistic projections, Dr. Martinez said, consulting data from monitoring stations that now combined ancient seismic detection principles with modern geological instrumentation. Surface communities that adopted the sustainable technology protocols are not just surviving, they're thriving in ways that our old infrastructure models never achieved. Professor Chun had spent the months since the disaster documenting and translating the vast archive of knowledge that the underground cities have preserved. The time capsule collection contains detailed records of technological development, social organization, agricultural innovation, and environmental management spanning multiple catastrophic cycles, he said, setting down a stack of translated manuscripts. We're looking at a complete alternative model for human civilization development. Maria had become something of a cultural bridge herself, helping modern communities understand and adapt to the sustainable practices that the ancient civilization had refined over centuries. The most challenging aspect isn't the technology, she explained. It's helping people understand that cooperation and collective decision-making can be more effective than individual competition and hierarchical control. The surface community that had grown up around the waterfall was a remarkable example of what could be achieved when ancient wisdom was combined with contemporary knowledge and necessity. Buildings were constructed using both traditional materials and modern techniques, but designed according to principles that could survive geological disasters while minimizing environmental impact. Agricultural systems combined ancient understanding of sustainable farming with contemporary knowledge of nutrition and food preservation. Most importantly, the community had adopted social structures that balanced individual autonomy with collective responsibility, creating systems for decision-making and resource management that could adapt to changing circumstances without losing democratic principles or human dignity. Ryan's own transformation had been as profound as that of the community around him. He had returned to California long enough to submit his resignation from the Sacramento Police Department and arrange for early retirement. The skills he had developed in law enforcement, pattern recognition, crisis management, community organization had proved invaluable in the work of building sustainable communities, but the context and purpose had shifted completely. The federal agencies have finally acknowledged the validity of the cyclical disaster predictions, he said, reviewing reports from emergency management officials who were now studying the ancient warning systems with serious scientific interest. FEMA is requesting consultation on incorporating sustainable shelter design into their disaster preparedness protocols. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The same federal authorities who had restricted access to the tunnel system were now seeking guidance from the people. They had dismissed as amateur archaeologists and conspiracy theorists, but perhaps more significant was the grassroots response to the knowledge that had emerged from the underground cities. Communities throughout Central America and beyond were experimenting with sustainable technologies, cooperative social structures, and disaster preparedness systems based on principles that had been tested through centuries of catastrophic cycles. Alana had emerged from the underground cities to serve as something of an ambassador between the hidden civilization and the surface world, helping facilitate the knowledge transfer that could transform how human societies related to their environment and to each other. The time capsule collection was always intended as a gift to future civilizations, she explained as they sat in the community center that had been built near the waterfall. Our ancestors understood that knowledge preserved but not shared eventually becomes irrelevant. The purpose of survival is not just preservation, but renewal and growth. As evening approached, Ryan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him from investigating a simple disaster scene to helping facilitate what might be the most significant social transformation in human history. The personal loss that had driven him to seek meaning through work had evolved into a deeper understanding of community and purpose that he had never expected to find. The time capsule collection represented more than just archived knowledge. Represented proof that human beings could adapt to the most challenging circumstances while maintaining their essential humanity. It offered hope that modern civilization could learn to live sustainably with natural forces rather than fighting losing battles against them. Margaret would have understood. Ryan thought as he watched the sun set over a landscape that had been reshaped by both geological forces and human adaptation. She had always believed that the most important work was helping people through difficult transitions, finding ways to preserve what was valuable while adapting to new circumstances. The cyclical disasters that had shaped this region for centuries weren't ending. The geological forces that created them were permanent features of the Earth's structure. But the human response to those cycles could evolve, and the knowledge preserved through 9 centuries of underground survival proved that adaptation and cooperation were possible, even under the most extreme circumstances. As the stars became visible in the clear night sky, Ryan realized that they were all part of a much larger story. Now, not just the story of surviving one catastrophic cycle, but the story of how human civilization could learn to work with natural forces rather than against them. The ancient civilization had given them more than warnings about recurring disasters. They had given them a model for sustainable survival that could transform how future generations prepared for and adapted to the challenges that the Earth would inevitably present. The next awakening of surface civilization had begun, built on foundations of ancient wisdom and contemporary innovation, tested by catastrophic forces and strengthened by the understanding that human dignity and community cooperation were the most reliable technologies for surviving anything the future might bring. And high above the transformed landscape, the waterfall continued its ancient song, no longer hiding secrets but celebrating the marriage of old knowledge with new possibilities. The endless cycle of destruction and renewal that defined both geological time and human hope.